Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, along with co-host Carson Becker. Carson, tell our listeners about yourself.
I'm a writer focused mainly on Central and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. My work has appeared in magazines like The Spectator and The Washington Examiner, and you can keep up with my work on X at Carson J. Becker.
Today, we're honored to host retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a distinguished military leader and strategic thinker.
General Hodges served as Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe from 2014 to 2017, playing a pivotal role in strengthening NATO's presence in Eastern Europe during these critical times. He continues to shape discourse on defense and security as Senior Advisor to Human Rights First and co-author of Future War and the Defense of Europe.
His extensive career spans decades of leadership in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Europe, making him an invaluable voice on military strategy and international cooperation. But before we begin our conversation, here are 3 key news items that are shaping our world today.
A catastrophic storm system has left at least 20 dead across the central and southern U.S., with historic flooding affecting 16 states. Emergency declarations have been issued as communities brace for continued flooding.
Markets worldwide are experiencing sharp declines amid escalating U.S. trade tariffs, with fears of a global recession mounting. Asian and European markets saw record drops today, while Treasury yields surged.
Russian airstrikes on Ukraine have intensified, with the deadly attack on Kryvyi Rih killing 20 people, including children. The humanitarian crisis continues to deepen as international responses struggle to address the growing conflict.
With that, let's dive into our interview.
General Hodges, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for the privilege and the opportunity.
We're now 3 months into the Trump administration. From your perspective, especially as it pertains to the situation in Europe, what concerns you and what gives you hope at the moment?
Well, what concerns me is that our allies are losing confidence in the United States. Not just because of for economic reasons, but trust. The intelligence that the United States enjoys is based not just on our satellites, but also on the networks, the bilateral and multilateral agreements we have with many or most European nations. And I think, I know for a fact that several of them are starting to pull back on what they share out of concern that what they might provide would be properly handled. That concerns me because it affects our own security. And then the alliance itself, NATO, never perfect, but the most successful alliance for 75 years, coming up on 76 years. And while it's indefensible that most nations have not done all that they should have done, that doesn't change that we benefit from NATO because it's about protecting our strategic interest in Europe. And a stable, secure Europe is important for a prosperous Europe, which is important for American prosperity. So these things is not about us guarding Germans. It's about protecting our interests in Europe. So I worry about those things.
From an intelligence gathering perspective, which of our allies and partners in Europe would you say provide the most value to the United States?
I'd be reluctant to say it was one because each of them brings capabilities, language, geographic and cultural and historical expertise. Obviously, the UK is at the top of the pile in terms of SIGINT and technical capabilities, but none of these nations will ever advertise, nor should they, what they can actually do, nor would the U.S. advertise specifics about what we get from them. But I just remember, obviously, I was in the Army for so long, very familiar with the Five Eyes arrangement, U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But the bilateral relationships we have with Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, and many other European countries is important for us. I went to visit Estonia back in 2015, right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And the Estonian intelligence officer was kind of briefing me on what they had seen. And I was astounded. I said, Kalpo, he's a lieutenant colonel and the Estonian officer in the Estonian military. I said, where did you get all this? Because I'm thinking Estonia doesn't have satellites. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "Sir, we live here. We all speak Russian too, and we understand what's going on the other side of our border." And I thought, wow, how naive was I to not realize how much we depend on our allies.
Do you get the sense when talking to our allies that they see this as a permanent break and that they can never rely on the United States, or do they see this as a temporary setback?
I think it depends a little bit on the country, but also on the demographic. Um, you know, I tease my German friends that the favorite sport in Germany has never been soccer. It's always been criticizing American policy, and they always laugh because they know it's true. But yet, at the same time, every German friend I have either went to school in the U.S. or their kids do, or they have business connections, or they vacation there, or they have a family member that lives there. And so, even if they criticize our policy over the decades, long before the current administration, they always held us to as an ideal that our Constitution and the checks and balances and all of this and of course they always envied the culture of innovation in the United States. They even if they didn't like our policy, they never worried about structural damage to the Constitution. At the same time, NATO has been through a lot. You and many of your listeners will know that the French kicked NATO out back in the 1950s. The British and the French were very unhappy with us during the Suez crisis because we forced them to stop what they were doing. There's Turkey and Greece are always at each other's throat, but stopping short of actually going to war because they're both in the alliance. And America had always played a critical role in keeping those two allies on side, if you will. So I guess what I'm saying is that many people are looking and hoping that this is not just a short-term interruption, but that it's not the end of the role that they have always counted on the United States to play. And I'm not talking about just defending them, because there is not one American soldier defending any German or Pole or Finn, but the leadership. Yeah, the nuclear deterrent obviously is important, but the Europeans actually can do everything else if they find the political will. They could do everything else, but it's the leadership around which they would always coalesce, and I think they worry about that.
Well, let me ask you this as a follow-up. Is there any rationale to President Trump's approach to Europe, right? Like, basically, it does seem that without us, they do have to step up and do more. He's been demanding for 8 years that NATO spends more, or NATO members spend more on defense. Is there any rationale that this could work? Because frankly, it doesn't seem to me that these individual countries in organizations like NATO or as a country of Germany can turn to anyone else.
Well, since the end of the Cold War, every American president has demanded more. But most of our European allies began to downsize immediately because they thought that we were never going to do this again. And by the way, the United States downsized in Europe. We went from about 300,000 down to 30,000, sent home all of our tanks. And so it's not surprising that Europeans also would have begun to reduce their defense investments because they thought we'd never have to do this again. What's different now is, and certainly President Trump is correct to criticize our allies that they have not done their share. They have not done enough to maintain the level of readiness. And the fact that the United States, even going back to Obama time when we first talked about pivoting to the Pacific, we don't have enough to do it all. And so for our own interests, we need Europe to be prepared to take on more of the defense and security of the European theater. But what's really different now is Vladimir Putin. I mean, we were sleeping after he invaded Georgia in 2008. We didn't take it serious. We didn't really react much after they invaded Ukraine in 2014. But now the Europeans can see that this is only going to get worse if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine. And so now there's a threat, and their populations can see it.
Carson, I was going to jump in with a follow-up on this. You're talking about President Obama's and the Obama administration's pivot to Asia in 2009 and in the second term in 2013. In hindsight, was that a mistake by the Obama administration? Should they have sort of retained the traditional focus that the Bush administration and the Clinton administration kept, especially
No,
now knowing what Putin's
I think that
intentions were?
these are not either or.
Okay.
Clearly, I mean, frankly, before the First World War, the U.S. was focused on the Pacific anyway. We had fought wars in the Pacific. That was where we were going. We were going west, and uh, after the First World War, then the Second World War, and U.S. people and governments realized that we couldn't just turn our back on Europe again. Otherwise, we'd be back over there once more. So the idea of creating a long-term stability with NATO and economic investments and helping make sure that we never had another European war was in the interest of the United States. But you had to be there. But the shifting of focus to the Indo-Pacific region under Obama and Trump won and Biden and Trump. I mean, this makes sense. It makes perfect sense. But that doesn't mean you can just walk away from Europe. Europe as a whole, as a bloc, is our biggest trading partner. And so it's in our interest that Europe be prosperous. And I think a more strategic approach to working with our allies on how they would help us protect our interests in Europe and give us the same access, but with a much less of a footprint. Having said that, as you guys probably know, there are only 100,000 Americans that are in Europe, troops of all flavors, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and about half of those are rotational, which means they come over for 6 months, 9 months. So the number of troops in Europe is actually very, very small. I mean, 100,000, that's what sits in Michigan football stadium. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Or maybe a Florida State Miami game that gets up close to 90,000. So for a relatively small investment, we have access, we have intelligence sharing, and we have allies that protect where most of our economic interests are. So I think finding the balance between priority to Pacific, with which I agree, but not walking away from Europe.
So I forget who it was. Maybe it was Michael Lewis or one of these smart folks, argued about 8 years ago that basically it was Ian Bremmer, that we needed a Moneyball approach to the world, that we needed to pick our regions and focus on them, that we couldn't necessarily be overly engaged in the Pacific or Asia or Europe. You're arguing basically, if I understand right, that it's not necessarily that expensive to maintain a presence in places like Europe, which do benefit us when it comes to negotiating and dealing with Asia and China.
Yeah, completely. I mean,
Okay.
we have, because of our relationships with European allies, we have this incredible intelligence network that helps with not just information on Russia or intelligence on Russia and China, but also terrorism networks, illegal activities, et cetera. Those are not things you just walk in a store and buy. These are built over decades. The second thing, the airfields and seaports that we have from our allies in UK, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Turkey, as well as up in Germany, that access gives us the ability not only to project power in Europe and Central Asia, but also the Middle East and in Africa. This is an important part of the American global strategic approach to protecting our strategic interests. So I've heard the Moneyball thing by Mr. Bremer. I'm not going to dispute it. I'm just saying every administration has to do an analysis of strategic interest. What are our interests? Nobody, including the U.S., can do it all alone. So you have to have a network of allies that can help ensure freedom of navigation, for example, which we depend on. Working up in the Arctic, there's no way the U.S. can protect all of its interests or defend against China and Russia in the Arctic without allies. I think what what we're working on out in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS to have a closer relationship with Australia and UK is going to help us counter Chinese naval power. So there's not one of those that I would say, well, I really wish we could do more in the Pacific or in Europe, but we just can't afford it. We have to. It's not your national security has to be based on priorities and interests and threats, not how much security can you afford. Obviously, you're always going to have to take risks. There's no doubt about that.
Real quick, I don't want to take all Carson's questions, but you have my mind moving. So, Carson, I'll let you take the next several. But obviously, last month we saw many leaders in Trump's national security team accidentally or allegedly accidentally include a reporter on their private chats for their attacks on Yemen. Do you think this is going to make our allies less likely to share intelligence and want to work with the U.S. on global events around the world?
Without a doubt. I mean, when you've got the Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the Vice President, and all the others that were there on a Signal chat group talking about, specific times and weapons platforms that were getting ready to launch an attack on the Houthis. I mean, this is like, even when I was a second lieutenant, I would have known that was unacceptable. And the fact that Director Gabbard and Mr. Waltz and Secretary Hegseth are all former Army officers, they had to have been through training and been certified to handle classified materials in their Army life. So this is, it's either incompetence or willful neglect. Now, this all would have been over immediately if Mr. Waltz or somebody said, okay, I have to, my fault, and do an investigation, end of story. The fact that nobody would even accept responsibility, which for me has always been the first principle of leadership, when there is a mistake, instead it would turn into a big cover-up or an attack on the journalists. I think that did a lot more damage than it might have done otherwise. And then finally, the fact that they were so casual on the discussion tells you this was not the first time. And so, of course, our enemies who already know how to hack Signal will be going back in and mining to find out what else could they possibly find, even if things were set to disappear after a few weeks. I mean, we should not underestimate the capabilities of all of our enemies.
Well, look, I think tying back into this, and I promise, Carson, the next one's yours, but do you worry that our allies are even more or less likely to want to deal with the U.S. and that the U.S. will lose its ability to wield influence around the world, given we're waging a trade war on them?
I'm not an economist, so I'm reluctant to make predictions about these things. But as I watch the reactions of everybody else, and try to assess, what's the long-term effect as well as the short-term effect, it's hard to see the goodness in all of this. Not disagreeing that we have had unfair trade relationships with different countries, but you guys and all your listeners have seen the memes and the jokes about the penguins and all of this stuff. I mean, it undermines whatever brilliance was in some of the tariffs. This kind of sledgehammer approach, and then the fact that you've got different explanations coming out of the administration of what the reasons are, it undermines what could be seen as useful in certain cases. And so, yes, of course, this will undermine our relationship with allies. I mean, last week you would have seen it, the picture of the gentlemen from China, South Korea, and Japan standing together, thinking about how they're going to protect themselves against American tariffs. Who else could possibly have pushed Japan and South Korea together to China? I mean, that's I hope that does not turn into something more significant.
You had mentioned that after the Cold War, a lot of the European armed forces got rid of equipment. They decreased their troop count. But other things have happened too since then, especially to the defense industrial base of Europe. You've seen a lot of shipyard closures. You've also seen on the infrastructure side, you've seen infrastructure being neglected. Newer infrastructure is not being built. Could you give us an overview of how severe the crisis of Europe's defense industrial base really is and how that problem might be addressed?
Yeah, Carson, great question. So, of course, in the United States, we also closed down a lot of our defense industry, our ammunition production capability. American shipbuilding today is not what it was even a few decades ago for a variety of reasons. And you hear our Navy complain all the time about how long it takes to get repairs done on submarines and other parts of our great Navy. So, yes, of course, Europe did uh, cash in the peace dividend after the Cold War way too much. The Dutch, the Netherlands, Royal Netherlands Army, they sold all their tanks to the Finns. You know, the Finns have never been confused about Russia or what the threat is. And so now the Finns have a sizable fleet of Leopard tanks, and they're not going to give them back to the Dutch. The German Bundeswehr, when I was a lieutenant in the 1980s, was enormous. It was the biggest, most modern military force in all of Europe. Obviously, today it's nowhere close to that. But they are, as you know, the German government just passed a law that would allow changes their legislation about whether or not they go into debt for defense spending. So now they're going to have a 500 billion euro um, fund to allow them to increase readiness and modernization of the German army. And equally important, in my view, is 500 billion euro going into infrastructure, because the ability for NATO forces to move rapidly into and across Europe is an important part of deterrence. Now, the defense industries of Europe um, are they all see now the need to grow. So that is starting to happen, but there are some legal and cultural things that limit them that I think have to be addressed. First of all, about half of the ammunition that is being produced in Europe today actually goes to customers outside of Europe, like in Africa and the Middle East. It's not illegal, and these are businesses. This is where I think governments could tell the companies, "Hey, look, we'll protect your liability, but we need to fill our own stocks first, and also we need to get this ammunition to Ukraine, and your customers in Uganda and UAE could wait." So that would be an indicator of political will, or changing restrictions on whether or not companies can produce things or expand without a direct order from their government. That is the case in Germany. That limits their ability to rapidly expand. And you've still got some holdover cultural things in Germany from the 60s where almost no universities do research, do R&D for military or defense purposes. And, you know, even the most liberal university in America would fight like a tiger to get a government grant for a defense project because of the money involved. Um, Almost no German universities do this. I think this is a cultural thing that's going to change.
In terms of infrastructure, what would you say are the major choke points in Europe at the moment?
Yeah, there's not enough rail capacity to move heavy equipment rapidly across Europe in numbers on short notice. If you want to do a big exercise here, you have to coordinate with DB Cargo, that's Deutsche Bahn Cargo, to get the trains necessary to move your tanks from Germany into Poland or up to Lithuania, for example. In a crisis, we would need to be able to move a significantly larger amount of armor across Europe on very short notice. So this rail capacity is one that concerns me a great deal. The bridges in the old days when it was West Germany, every single bridge had like this yellow shield on it that told you exactly what the capacity was, because you had NATO forces were always moving in and around West Germany. Now that the alliance, of course, is much larger, it includes Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and all the countries in between. We don't have as much. I'm not as confident in the bridges, frankly, to be able to hold the weight of Abrams tanks and Leopards and British Challengers and other large equipment. So improving that infrastructure is important. And then the third thing I would say, especially the U.S., but not only, we depend on European seaports to deploy into Europe. And there are quite a few, and we exercise with all of them. I'm not 100% all of them are as protected from a cyber strike, or also, frankly, from air and missile strike, but especially cyber that could shut down the ability to move in and out of places like Bremerhaven or Hamburg or Antwerp or Gdansk in Poland.
And how does one harden that critical infrastructure? And what kind of attack would you imagine could take place on something such as a seaport in the event of an actual conflict?
So, I bet you read it. There was an article in Wired magazine that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And I know I'm not the kind of person typically that would read Wired magazine, but somebody shared this article with me, and I was astounded. It was about the NotPetya attack that Russian cyber was going against a Ukrainian bank or tax office. I mean, it was a local thing like that. And it ended up hitting Maersk, which is one of the largest shipping companies in the world, and shut down their ports and their ability to move stuff. And that was because it got on one guy's iPad that was used for tracking product, moving in and out of the port. And that really opened my eyes to the vulnerability of our transportation infrastructure. Of first of all, that things could be shut down. Secondly, who's responsible for that? I mean, this is not a NATO type thing. The ports are all commercial, so who's walking around with a clipboard making sure that, okay, here Bremerhaven, they're ready for this, this, and this, and this, like like the military would do. So you have to test those things, and it's not cheap, of course, but it's much more expensive when you lose a critical port like Bremerhaven. But I would also expect that if Russia has made the terrible decision to attack a NATO country, they would also have made the terrible decision to launch ballistic missile strikes and drones against these ports. And the volume that we see hitting Ukraine every day, because they know that the alliance depends on rapid reinforcement. And so these seaports, I would expect to be hammered. And they know right now we don't have enough air and missile defense to adequately protect them.
Real quick, what, if you were to handicap it, are the odds of Russia attacking a NATO member? Like, are we at real risk of that happening?
Yes, the risk goes way up if Ukraine fails. And if Russia sees that Europe cannot get its act together, or that the United States has turned its back on Europe, then I think the Russians, the risk of them making that calculation that they could get away with it goes up. Because Ukraine should never fail. I mean, they have stopped Russia. But if at some point European countries and the U.S. completely walk away, say, you're on your own, bad luck, we can't afford it, then Russia would eventually be able to overwhelm Ukraine. They would absorb thousands of Ukrainian troops into the Russian army, and you're going to have 2, 3, 4 million more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Europe. And then I think the Russians would have a couple of years to reorganize and figure out what they could do. And of course, it would not be like a big giant red arrow going across Europe like they planned to do in the Cold War days. It would be something more limited into Lithuania, in my opinion, designed to break the alliance, to show that NATO would not actually react to that, and that would be, I think that would be the Russians' their principal objective.
How would a conflict like that unfold if they did take Lithuania? Do you think that NATO would hold? Are they strong enough?
Strong enough, yes. If deterrence fails, eventually, yes. But that would be after enormous costs. So this is why, the importance of strong deterrent, to make sure that the Russians never make this calculation that they think they could probably do it. And I think the way you do that is, obviously, you have to have credible, capable forces that are there, not on paper, but actually there, from nuclear deterrent as well as conventional deterrent and everything in between. But also, we have got to figure out how to properly address this gray zone threat that Russia their aggression that goes on out in the Baltic Sea, the constant destruction of underwater pipelines and cables, attacks on shipping companies, arson, sabotage, disinformation, all of these things. These are not just coincidental. This is a part of a Russian approach to cause disruption, to drive wedges between all of us, and to test. I mean, what are we willing to do? The fact that you've had Russian missiles that were going to Ukraine, but through Poland and Romania and Latvia, and we didn't do anything about it. We hadn't shot any of them down. These are the kind of ways that they continuously test. So the alliance has got to figure out a way. How do you address that?
In your 40 years in the Army, you've certainly seen a lot of change in terms of warfare and technology. How significant of a development is the rapid expansion of drone tech that we've seen in Ukraine and the sort of democratization of the precision strike on the battlefield?
Well, that's a good way to phrase it.
General Hodges, I told you Carson was smarter than me.
Yeah,
Clearly.
Man, UVA, a great university. That's who ended our winning streak in the ACC.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about that.
My apologies.
No, don't apologize.
Land of Jefferson, but
look, I was a brigade commander in the 101st when we invaded Iraq in 2003, and so when we did this assault from Kuwait up into Iraq, I had exactly 0 drones in my brigade. And we were at the tip of the spear in terms of modernization and so on. I had 0. I couldn't tell you what was happening 2 kilometers in front of me unless I was able to talk to one of our helicopters. I mean, so that alone, the increased situational awareness at the tactical level of what's out there, and then of course you improve it by adding strike capability, so that platoon leaders now and company commanders are controlling, at the captain level, are controlling strike capability to hit targets in their area of responsibility. That's significant. Now, but that's a new capability. It doesn't change the nature of war, but it certainly changes the character of war. The second thing is, of course, there's a drone arms race. How do you counter it? Ever since the first guy picked up a knife and the other guy picked up a shield, there's always been this competition to figure out how do you counter what the other side is doing. And I'm pretty sure that our military is watching closely what the Ukrainians and the Russians are doing to figure out, so that we don't have to start from 0. I mean, we all know that. Eventually there will come a way that the drone itself is not seemingly unstoppable. I mean, that somebody will counter it and we'll figure out how to do it. What has been most impressive for me is what the Ukrainians have done at sea with maritime drones. Our great Navy has worked hard on improving or developing maritime unmanned systems. And what the Ukrainians have done is, I mean, they defeated the Black Sea Fleet without having a traditional Navy of their own. That's impressive.
Real quick, General Hodges, I'm aware that we're coming up on our limit of time, but what do you see as the next stages in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's clear that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine unless something dramatic happens. After 11 years, the Russians still only control 20% of Ukraine. There is no big armored mobile force hiding in the woods waiting to come in and break through and exploit the way their grandfathers did against the German Wehrmacht back in 1943-44. That doesn't exist. So really all the Russians can keep doing is launching drones and missiles against civilian infrastructure, which is awful, it's terrible, but it's not decisive. It's not going to, I mean, we bombed the hell out of Germany and Japan for years. That was not what ultimately won the war. The Russians just don't have the ability to knock Ukraine out. unfortunately, the Ukrainians also do not have the ability to knock Russia out like I thought a couple of years ago when I thought that our government was going to give them what they needed. Because we, the U.S., never said we want Ukraine to win because it's in our interest, not for charity, but because it's in our interest. We failed to develop the necessary policies that would give Ukraine the ability to actually win. So we're at a place now where I think Russia is in big trouble economically. It's propped up artificially, and if we could do something somehow to use our economic power so that they could not keep exporting oil and gas to China and India, which is how they pay for what they're doing. Um, and if we can make sure that they have the ammunition that they need and improve their air and missile defense capabilities, then I think Ukraine is able to hold on longer than Russia actually can. But the key would be the West deciding we wanted that to happen and using our economic tools. Um, the Ukrainians, they're defending their home. That's they're not confused about what happens. There's not going to be some sort of surrender ceremony, and then that's the end of it. It will be Bucha and Mariupol all over Ukraine if that happens.
Carson, final question to you if you have anything.
Yeah, it seems very evident now that the war in Ukraine and a number of other factors are really putting strain on the European political system. You've got a lot of tensions in countries like Romania and Germany. You've got a change in the political dynamic, perhaps the most significant in the last 60 years. How do you see Europe holding up against these increased economic and military threats? And do you think its institutions are prepared for it?
I am actually more optimistic now than I was even a year ago because you're seeing some European leaders that are acting with more courage and decisiveness. You look at President Stubb of Finland. I mean, this guy is amazing. He's a Furman graduate, by the way, in South Carolina. He can drop from his Finnish English to South Carolina very quickly. It's hilarious. That guy is good. I mean, he's a strategic thinker. He's articulate, and Finland is in a very good place. Sweden, the same. Germany, which you mentioned, has gone through this election now. Just a few weeks ago, they're hammering out what the coalition is going to look like. So I'm encouraged that somebody like Friedrich Merz is going to be the German Bundeskanzler. But the AfD, which of course is the right-wing party that nobody else wants to see in power, they're growing. And so there will be a lot of pressure on the coalition government led by the Christian Democrats, the CDU, and the CSU, which is the Bavarian partner in this union, that if they don't deliver, if they don't improve the immigration issues that Germany is facing, if they can't address that, and if they can't improve economically, then AfD will do a lot better in the next 4 years or in the next election, and they will become part of the government. So that's a challenge that most of Germany would hope they don't have to face. The French, as you know, of course, Marine Le Pen, she's been convicted. Of course, certain people have called this out as a political thing. The fact is, she was convicted of embezzlement, not some made-up thing. So I don't have any sympathy for her. And actually, the protests in the streets of France have not been so significant that tells me it's a gigantic problem. That Macron has really seemed to rise to the occasion, and even Prime Minister Starmer in UK, while he's having huge problems domestically, he has stepped forward in a strong way. They've got to address their own issues in UK as well. I see zero chance right now of UK coming back into EU, but that changes later. And then finally, Poland, Prime Minister Tusk is a very savvy, experienced leader. They do have a presidential election coming up, and that will be interesting to see what direction that goes.
General Hodges, I want to thank you again for joining us. Where can our listeners follow your current work?
Well, I am on Twitter at X at General_Ben. But I really like getting on a podcast like this because you have your own sort of unique audience. And I appreciate it when you guys give me an opportunity like this. And good questions.
Thanks again for joining Clearer Than Truth, the show where we distill complex issues. Be sure to tune in next time.